Hi, and welcome to the Deer IQ podcast, where smart hunting begins. I'm Adam Lewis, and we're wrapping up our exciting series, Mature Buck Mindsets, looking at the mind of big bucks and big buck hunters and just how exceptionally different they are. In this episode, I'm joined by a guest that is a legend in deer research and as an author, John Ozoga. You've probably read his stuff in major magazines, and we look at his research of buck behavior and the science of what he calls buck societies. Now, John is in his late 80s and joining me on the phone, and I'm pretty sure he's never done a podcast. So look at this episode similar to how you would if sitting next to the fire with Grandpa there, and he's doing most of the talking, and you're there just soaking it up. Okay, so here are the top things to look for during this episode. What and where is John's research background on whitetail deer? An important distinction to make when comparing your area to his. Why does he say bucks and does are like dealing with two different species when talking about deer behavior? How does a young deer join a buck society, and what does that phrase actually mean? How do young bucks behave in the absence of mature bucks, and what might this tell us about the deer age structure where it's being observed? What does John say about mature buck behavior in low versus high deer density areas, and just how should you hunt those areas differently? And what is early season buck sign a good indication of? And there's a lot more in there, so let's get to the podcast and up your deer IQ. All right, I'm here with John Ozoga, and we're going to be talking about mature bucks and science in a two-part series here. So the first part is really trying to dig into mature buck mindsets. And John, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you. Appreciate talking to you.
Yeah, it's great to have you on. Listeners might know you from, you have a really long career in the hunting field, right? You've been a writer for a long time for deer and deer hunting, and I know you from Woods and Water. We both write for both of those. But tell us a little bit.
My background is pretty well split. I spent 33 years researching 95% of that whitetail deer. Then I spent another 30 years trying to educate the hunters relative to what we knew scientifically about deer. So my background is kind of cut right in half there.
Yeah, so you have a ton of I guess knowledge to share, and your emphasis was you did a lot of science research, right, on deer specifically.
Yes, like I say, 30 years of research. Both in a natural environment and in my square mile enclosure where I had complete control over the deer population. We could watch that population, live trap it, mark individuals for recognition, and then census the population completely every year by trapping out during the winter, x-raying the does to see how many fawns they carried, and introduce a population according to what our specific research was for that time. So we had not only had the natural experience. I worked with yarded deer. In the north, I'll emphasize my experience has been related to northern deer. So there's going to be differences from what I learned for northern deer and how southern deer might respond. I'll acknowledge that right away.
Right, and any scientist I've talked to always says that, we can draw maybe generalizations about deer because deer are deer, but there might be specific differences depending on, the part of the country where you're at. So
our deer herd up in northern Michigan is controlled by winter weather and winter habitat. But you've got to, when you talk about deer and you want to talk about bucks, you've got to realize that we're talking about a species where the doe population and the buck population are actually very separate. It's like dealing with two different species. They have different seasonal habits. They have different seasonal physiology. They have different seasonal nutritional needs. They're very, very different. And so at some point, of course, the male, young male has to be born into the female society, but at some point he's got to leave it. And that's on an annual basis. Some deer, of course, breed as fawns. Ours seldom breed as fawns up here. Most of them breed their first year as yearlings. But what happens at fawning time, the doe becomes very territorial, and she drives off her 1-year-old fawns who are insistent upon following the mother around. But they'll stay in the general vicinity. Most of them, I'm not saying all of them, but most of them will stay in the general vicinity. And then come late July, early August, they will generally reunite with their mother. Well, the female, the older female, the mother will be dominant. So the young females kind of accept this subordinate role. But the male, who then is 1.5 years old, he's got antlers coming, he's got a whole different attitude. He's not going to put up with that. He's not going to put up with motherhood domination. He's going to decide to disperse and join the buck society. He has to become an individual associated with other bucks and join the society. Now, the complex of a male society is going to be dependent upon male mortality. And most places so intensively harvest adult bucks that there almost is no semblance of the natural male social system. You can't have a nice even age structure where the most dominant are the oldest. So the others that join that society accept a lower social status. But it's interesting to see when that happens. Like I say, that young male to mature male behavior will generally take place in September. It stands out quite a bit in September. And by then the bucks are rubbing out of antler velvet, and they start to intermingle a lot more with young deer. And it's interesting to see that on occasion in September you'll have a gigantic buck with about 12 points encounter a young yearling with spike horns. And that big buck will actually just lower his antlers. He'll just lower his head and allow that young buck to smell them and even click his antlers in there. There's no sign of fighting. It's just a communication factor. Now, that a month later, that won't happen. Once the breeding season is getting close and bucks are vying for dominance, that won't happen. But it's likely a young buck learns or gains some kind of association during that time period. And of course, then the older buck, the mature buck, will commence. He'll be the one that'll be making all the scrapes and most of the antler rubs. In populations where you only have young deer, yearling deer, a few 2.5s, you're not gonna see very much antler rubbing or scraping behavior. That's a dominant factor that the mature bucks show at first. They're most intense, and they will make a lot of antler rubs, and it's interesting to see that even fawns will inspect those antler rubs for odor and identity, because the buck is rubbing it with his antlers and leaving his scent on it. He may even lick it, but he'll leave his individual scent on that signpost, you might call it. And young deer associate that run away with who made it. And then the scrape is pretty much the same thing.
Well, let me jump in real quick, John. There's a lot a lot to talk about. So let me back up for a second before we get into rubs and scrapes and stuff. You talked about this difference, obviously between bucks and does, and that's kind of interesting, that whole process. Can you talk a little bit more about the process of a buck being socialized into, I think you called it the buck society? Like, exactly what does that look like, and how is that important for a buck, and I guess develop that buck? There's this. You can almost compare it to humans, right? At some point, humans, we leave the nest, right? We get out on our own, have to prove ourselves, all those things, and become an adult. And I'm guessing it's kind of similar to that. But what does that look like?
Like I say, it's essential. A male cannot stay in the female society, because the does will dominate him. The adult does will dominate him at a young age. He cannot stay there. He may get dominated when he joins a male society. He certainly will be dominated at a young age, but he will be accepted. He won't be driven away. He just has to behave himself. That's the only thing. But those markings have individual identity to him. So in that young buck's travels, he can figure out where that range is. If he's accepted into it, then he knows where he can identify that range, and he'll be there. Now, it may, in some populations, if you have maybe a pretty complex male society, that young buck may have to wander a long ways, but he's going to separate spatially from where he was born and from where his mother's association or social group has formed. So it's a process, I suppose, a better genetic behavior process where he separates. There will be no inbreeding within the family. He'll be, because the mature does won't accept him as a breeding buck. He has to go somewhere else. He'll be dominated in his own group. But he's got to work his way up. I'm not saying that yearling bucks don't do breeding. They do, especially in heavy hunted populations. If you shoot, and we did it in our enclosure studies. In some of our studies at Trapo, we removed all bucks of a year old or older. So we only left yearling bucks in the population. But they had totally different behavior come the breeding season. They didn't make as much scrapes. They didn't make as much rubs. There was not as much late summer association. It just suddenly, the rut was suddenly upon them, and they raced around and bred as many does as they could. But it was a very different thing from a point of management. You might say it wasted a lot of energy because they had no set association before that. So that the two breeding populations, one with only young bucks and one with older structured bucks, be very different. And I suspect there are places where that happens. I don't say the bucks are totally annihilated, but to find a 3.5-year-old buck in some of those populations is pretty difficult, if not impossible, where the deer are really heavily hunted.
Yeah. So in a state that's highly pressured, that's interesting. You have a lot of younger bucks involved in breeding, and you're kind of saying that in a place like that, an area or a state where there's heavy hunting pressure and a lot of these older bucks are being taken, that you won't see as much buck sign because basically these young bucks,
you won't.
They don't know what they're doing.
You won't in a heavily hunted herd. And it will be late. You won't see it in September or early October. You won't see it until just about the time the breeding season starts. No, that rubbing, scraping behavior of adult bucks in our northern populations, of course, our deer might migrate say 50 miles from where they summer to where they winter. The bucks are included. So when they come back in the spring, those bucks are inclined to rescent a lot of their scrapes. They may not necessarily scrape them, but if you monitor those limb tips that hang out over the scrape and kind of wipe them off with something and went back and checked them, you'll find that there's deer hair on there and there's oily secretions. So they come back to their original home range and identify it. So if you miss shooting one of these mature bucks one year and he survives the winter, you have a second chance there if you can figure out what he's doing. Now, he might have a summer range that is relatively small, and then come breeding season, he may cover a very large area. He may only occupy maybe a couple hundred acres in the summer, where if he's in a pretty low deer population come rut, he may cover 3-4 square miles with no problem at all. So you could hunt in an area, and all of a sudden there's this monster buck there. You never had any indication of seeing him before or seeing his presence, but he might just suddenly show up. That's a possibility. Now, others in a more structured society with a proper female social group and the age-structured male society, I think it's more set and more permanent. That buck is more inclined to use the same breeding ground year after year. He's not likely to go that far. If there are enough does in his area, he may be very content just to work it over very intensively and stay right there. So the behavior is going to depend upon deer density, buck density, and buck age. What you see or don't see is going to tell you a lot, believe me.
Yeah, so there's a lot in there. So if you are scouting a certain area and you're not seeing that sign very early in the year, you might be able to conclude maybe that, well, there's maybe a lot of young bucks around here that just don't know what they're doing. They're not getting started yet. If you're starting to see scrapes early in the year and more buck sign early.
If you see scrapes early in the year,
okay, so here is your high IQ moment. A buck society is an interesting concept to think about and does explain a lot of behavior. When I've noticed a lot of aggressive buck sign early in the year, like rubs and active scrapes, it's usually a sign of more than one mature buck competing for available resources. This drives the bucks to stake a claim to the area and also be active in it, increasing your chances of daylight encounters, which is exactly what you need. They are competing for space in a buck society and establishing the pecking order of dominance. If there is only one mature buck or none, you will not see this because it's not necessary behavior. So looking for this is a big thing to key in on for early season movement on multiple bucks and seeing them in daylight. That's something to think about and definitely look for. And do you know your deer IQ? Do you think you're deer smart? Why don't you take our new and enhanced deer IQ test and find out? This is different than the one last year and is an in-depth, comprehensive assessment that reveals your strengths, weaknesses, and exactly where to focus to see results in the woods. It's the only tool out there designed by an educator that can tell you this vital information and is specifically made for those serious about improving as a deer hunter. Check that out, link below, as well as our other high IQ services such as private land plans, getting a public land analysis of exactly where you hunt, and our weekend workshop coming up this summer, a truly one-of-a-kind educational experience you won't want to miss. All those are below. All right, and now let's get back to the podcast. more buck sign early.
If you see scrapes early in the year, till maybe September or late September, you can count on seeing a buck that's certainly 2.5 years of age or probably older, more like 3 or 4. So yeah, that early scraping is a very indicative thing. And rubbing is to a degree the same way. Yearling bucks only make about 40% as many antler rubs as mature bucks. So the buck sign is indicative of probably a good hunting spot. It's no guarantee,
right?
But you have a better indication there.
Yeah, last year this was something that I saw. So I hunt a lot of public land, and I was scouting a certain spot, and in August I found a very active scrape, big tracks in it, and there was probably a handful of mature bucks there. So I'd say 3 years old or older. And they were hitting that scrape consistently. And that seemed odd to me because here in Michigan, we typically don't have a very good age structure, in a lot of areas. So you start seeing stuff like that, and I wound up taking one of those bucks. You start seeing stuff like that early on. That's a real good indication that, hey, not only is there maybe one, but there might be competition. So is that something that you found as well, that the more mature bucks you have in an area, the more they're going to show that, and you'll see this sign earlier in the year?
Yeah, the early sign is a good indicator. It's no guarantee. It's no guarantee that buck that made that early sign is going to be there on November 15th. But it's a likelihood if you have a fairly decent population. If you have a very sparse population, it's hard to say where he will be come hunting season. He could be anywhere. He may be miles away. You don't know. So you have no guarantee in that respect. The other thing you see is that if you allow a buck population to become very mature, and you have a lot of older bucks in it, you're going to see natural buck mortality from fighting. A buck at 4.5 years old or so is not very receptive to being a subordinate in a male society. As he ages, even though there may be 7 or 8 year old bucks in there that are very aggressive and very dominant, that 3 or 4 year old runs the risk of overdoing it and maybe being annihilated in the process, because he will interact with those ones. No, in other cases, I've seen mature bucks that really had a system, a real tight male society, and all they would have to do when they encountered another mature buck is just give him a dirty look, lower his head, pin his ears back, and that subordinate would gladly move aside. So it depends, but of course once you get breeding going on and there are receptive does, then anything can happen. You never know how the subordinate's going to act. He may just overdo it, and you may see, locked antlers or dead deer from fighting injuries or something else. But and the point with the scrape, of course, is just because you got a scrape doesn't guarantee that big buck is going to be back there very often. It may be a good place, but you're going to have to stay alert to what's going on. Just because a buck made a nice scrape in end of October doesn't necessarily he's going to run up there every day and look at it to see. The scrape will draw other deer attention, especially does and fawns, because it has an identity to it. Whether it's even during the summer, the scent marked limbs will have an identity to them, so that the younger deer and the females will certainly visit those scrapes. Certainly the subordinate bucks will on occasion, but they're not going to make a habit of it, you know.
Yeah. So yeah, in that case, the story I was saying, that was in August, and to me, that told me that there was competition there. There was a reason for them to kind of mark their territory. There was more than one buck doing it. And yeah, you have to be on top of things, scouting all the time, because, and we can talk about this maybe later, but there's, what percent of scrapes are made in daylight or visited in daylight versus in dark. But let's go back to talking about mature bucks and mature buck mindsets and how mature bucks are different. So we throw around this term, and mature buck is a term that gets thrown out a lot in the hunting community. How would you define, so as a research scientist, how do you define a mature buck? Like, what does that mean? What is the age range of that? What does that actually mean?
A buck doesn't reach his mature physical size until he's, possibly 8-9 years old. He's still growing. He's still bigger. He's got bigger antlers. So however you want to, I'm not sure how you want to identify maturity. If it's antlers and body weight, it's, 8-9 years old. If it's behavior, strictly behavior, his behavior may be mature at a much younger age. And like I say, I saw records of bucks living to be 17 years old. I've never encountered one that lived beyond 12 in this northern environment. But there's a process there of maturity that, like I say, it depends upon a lot of factors. The surroundings, for one thing,
Yeah, you talk about that.
Certainly, by the time a buck is 3.5 or 4.5, he's getting there. His antlers could be, say, at 4.5 years old, his antlers could be very, very impressive. And if there are other factors involved, if there's injury involved, or they're exceptionally tough winters, there's malnutrition involved, at 5.5 or 6.5, he may not grow any bigger antlers than he did at 4.5. But if you have good nutritional conditions and year round, he uses up about 25% of his antler or his rutting body weight fatness during the rut. So at the end of the rut, by the 1st of November or December or so, he is a pretty lean animal without much reserve. So he's got to have a decent winter environment to get enough food to stay alive. Now, I've never seen a lot of buck mortality. I've seen wild deer populations where I had 100 dead deer per square mile. And there were mature bucks in the area, but only about 7% of the deaths were bucks. Period. They're just a buck is just, for some reason, exceptionally tough and durable compared to a young growing animal or even a female. Although we've got 20-year-old females in the area too. So. It's when you talk about maturity, it kind of, it all depends.
Yeah, it's interesting. So it kind of depends on maybe the society of bucks in your area, right? So
Exactly,
they might mature and enter the breeding pool quicker if there's not as many older bucks. But if that's more balanced, those older bucks kind of keep the younger bucks to an extent out of the breeding pool. And I think I read a study, there's a study out there about antler size and potential versus age, and I think it's around, I think the 3.5 is 80% of potential, 4.5 is like 90% of potential of antler
That
size.
sounds pretty good.
Yeah.
I'd say I would agree with that, certainly. Yeah.
And there's
But no, you got to realize too. No, in the north, not very many doe fawns breed. But in more southern, mild environment, you might have half of the doe fawns breed. And that breeding is going to occur about a month later than mature doe breeding. So you either have a two-peak rut rhythm, or more likely, I would say, a prolonged rut period. It may start in October, and it might not end till the end of January. In a population where you have high doe fawn breeding, but there's also indications that buck fawns could certainly, in the same population, buck fawns could breed doe fawns. They would be capable if the doe is that physically fit, and that's where she's in the right environment. There's genetic relationships there, but it's possible that even if you shot the daylights out of a population, it's possible that young buck fawns or yearling bucks could certainly handle the breeding potential that was there. So it gets kind of complicated.
Yeah. So I want to kind of wrap up this session. We've talked about a lot of different things, and I have, I think, 2 questions here from what we talked about. The first question is, if you could just, I guess, briefly, like for mature bucks, if guys want to hunt mature bucks, from what you know, and it may be very complicated and depend on the area, but what advice would you give them if that's what they're targeting? These deer, let's say, that are 3 years or older, and they want to get better at hunting them. What would you say to those hunters?
I don't know. You've got to look for buck sign first of all to find them. If you have minimal rubbing, scraping, they're not going to be there. So you do have to at least look for an abundance of buck sign. That's no guarantee that buck is going to be there. Like I said, it will depend upon the population, the density, and so forth. But you certainly stand a better chance that buck, I suspect in a heavily hunted population, I suspect that bucks do have their favored cover, their favorite hiding cover. I had bucks that in my population that during the rut they were running around constantly, day and night. But I had other bucks who really didn't. They didn't really do much traveling until close to sunset, and then by sunrise they quit and went home, and back to their favored cover. I think most bucks will have a favored cover situation. Now, how you can identify that, I don't know. I would have to say, but the amount of buck sign, rubs and scrapes would be indicative of a more concentrated area.
Yeah. So really, if I can summarize that, really doing your scouting and knowing your bucks. Like if you can, and I did a podcast a while back with Bronson Strickland, and we talked about buck personalities. So if you can really figure out your bucks through scouting and a lot of observation, and try to figure out their personality and where their home is, you're going to have a better chance. So, okay, well, John, thank you for coming on and discussing that. We're going to take a break here, but we'll go next time and get into a little more specifics of deer science and advanced deer science. All right, so here are your high IQ takeaways and challenges. Are you doing your scouting and land management with buck societies in mind? How can this broader picture of how bucks actually interact in your area drive your hunting decisions and strategies? And next, we're starting a new series on advanced deer science. This was a real popular one this past year, and we're going even further this time to demystify and clarify the deer science and how it applies to you. You won't want to miss those high IQ episodes, and I'll see you then.